The late afternoon sun stretched across the sleepy southern town, painting its streets and buildings in a warm, golden hue. Henry Lawson walked slowly, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn jacket, his steps measured and deliberate. At 68, his stride had lost some of its vigor, but his back remained straight, his posture as unyielding as the principles that had guided him through war, family, and life in a place that had often demanded more from him than it gave. Henry was a man the town knew well, not for any grand gestures or accolades, though he had plenty of those. He was known simply for being steady, a Vietnam veteran who came back home not to fanfare but to quiet judgment. He'd built his life piece by piece. He worked hard, never spoke louder than necessary, and kept to himself, save for the afternoons spent at the local Veterans Hall, where old friends gathered to sip coffee and trade stories about their younger, stronger days. It was on his way back from one such afternoon that he noticed the scene unfolding in the park. At first, it was just a sound, a sharp voice cutting through the stillness. Then, he saw them, a young man, barely more than a boy, standing frozen in front of Officer Ethan Riggins. Henry paused. The officer's voice carried, loud and clipped, an edge to it that Henry recognized all too well. Riggins was a man whose presence commanded a certain type of attention. Not through respect but intimidation. Stocky and broad, he carried himself with a confidence that had been, for years, unchecked. His reputation preceded him, whispering in the barbershops and church pews, in the way people avoided his gaze when he patrolled the streets. The young man stood rigid, his hands trembling as he fumbled in his pocket. Around them, a small crowd had begun to gather. No one moved closer, no one spoke. They watched with a mix of curiosity and discomfort, unsure of whether to stay or walk away, as though their presence might make them complicit in whatever was about to happen. Henry sighed and adjusted his hat. He didn't want to get involved. He never had a taste for conflict. But something about the boy's shaking hands, the way his eyes darted wide with fear, stirred something in him. He had seen that look before, decades ago, in men too young to carry rifles but sent to war all the same. He approached slowly, deliberately. Everything all right here, officer? Riggins turned sharply, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Henry. For a moment, his expression shifted, annoyance, perhaps, or the sudden realization that he was being watched. This doesn't concern you, Lawson, he snapped. Move along. Henry didn't flinch. His voice, when he spoke again, was calm, almost conversational. Doesn't look like the boy's done anything wrong. He nodded toward the young man, whose hands were still fumbling. You got his ID? He's hiding something. Riggins shot back, his jaw tight. He didn't reach for the ID the boy had finally pulled from his pocket. Instead, he stepped closer, his chest puffed, his voice louder now. I told you to walk away. The boy's hands shook harder, and Henry felt the crowd around them grow quieter. He noticed the way they shifted uncomfortably, the way no one looked directly at Riggins. That was the way it was, wasn't it? People saw but didn't see. They heard but stayed silent. Henry glanced at the boy again. He couldn't have been more than 20. A college student maybe, or someone's younger brother. No need for trouble here, Henry said, his tone steady, almost casual. Why don't we let him go on his way? But Riggins wasn't listening anymore. His face reddened, his fists clenched, and Henry saw the moment it happened. The moment when anger eclipsed reason. When the weight of whatever Riggins carried inside him found its target. The shove came fast, harder than Henry expected. He stumbled back, his boots scraping against the pavement, his balance momentarily lost. The crowd gasped a sharp intake of collective breath. But no one moved. Henry caught himself, straightened, his hand brushing the dirt from his jacket. He could feel the ache in his joints, the familiar reminder of his age. But he stood firm. I'm not looking for a fight, Henry said softly, though his voice carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. But you don't need to do this. Riggins didn't respond. He didn't hesitate. The punch came next, swift and brutal, connecting squarely with Henry's face. The world tilted. Henry stumbled, his body crumpling as he hit the ground. His head struck the pavement with a sickening crack, And then there was nothing but the sound of someone screaming, a woman's voice. High and panicked. And the distant, muffled echo of sirens that seemed to come too late. The park grew still again, save for the murmurs of the crowd and the hum of a dozen cell phones recording what had just happened. Riggins stood over Henry, his chest heaving, his fists still clenched. For a moment, he looked almost surprised, as though he hadn't expected the fall to be so loud, the blood pooling beneath Henry's head to be so bright. And then the panic set in. Riggins barked into his radio, his voice shaky, his words clipped and hurried. Backup. Injured suspect. Need medical assistance. Suspect. The word hung in the air, hollow and wrong. The young man who had been at the center of it all stood frozen, his ID still clutched in his trembling hands. He looked at Henry, then at Riggins, then at the crowd, as though searching for something. Someone to make sense of what had just happened. Henry lay still on the ground, his body fragile in a way it had never seemed before. The sirens grew louder, and as the paramedics arrived, the whispers began to spread through the town. By nightfall, the videos would be online. By morning, the world would know what had happened in the quiet part of a quiet town. But for now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, all that remained was the silence. The heavy, suffocating kind that came when words were no longer enough. The sound of the phone's ring cut through the quiet of the office. Sharp and insistent, Darius Lawson glanced at it for a moment before answering, his movements practiced and deliberate. As the state attorney general, calls like these came at all hours. They brought news of political wrangling, pressing legal cases, and the occasional reminder of how heavy his title could weigh. But this call was different. He felt it before the voice on the other end even spoke. Mr. Lawson, the voice, a woman's, wavered slightly. It's about your father. He's been hurt. For a moment, Darius didn't respond. The words settled over him, strange and distant. His father, Henry Lawson, hurt? It didn't make sense. Henry was steady, unshakable. Hurt didn't happen to men like him. What happened? He asked, his tone calm but edged with something colder. The woman explained quickly, her words tumbling over one another. An altercation with a police officer in the park. Henry intervening. An unprovoked attack. A coma. Darius let the words wash over him. But they didn't land. Not at first. He stood there, the phone pressed to his ear, surrounded by the quiet hum of his office. The walls, lined with degrees and framed photographs, seemed to close in slightly. Thank you, he said, finally, his voice clipped. I'll be there soon. He hung up the phone and stared at it for a long moment. The silence returned, but it was heavier now. Slowly, he reached for his jacket and briefcase. His movements methodical, the practiced motions of a man accustomed to keeping himself in control. The hospital was exactly as he remembered it, sterile, impersonal, the air thick with the faint smell of disinfectant and something else. Something harder to name. Darius had always hated hospitals. They reminded him of endings. A nurse directed him to the room where his father lay, her voice low and respectful. He's stable, but his condition is critical. The doctors are doing everything they can. When Darius stepped inside, the sight of his father stopped him cold. Henry Lawson, a man who had weathered wars, personal and political, lay motionless on the hospital bed. Machines beeped softly, their rhythm steady, as if mocking the frailty of the body they monitored. Darius approached slowly. He was not a man easily moved. Not by tears, not by sentiment. But there was something about seeing his father this way that struck him. It wasn't just the stillness. It was the vulnerability. He stood at the edge of the bed, his hands in his pockets. Hey, Dad, he said softly, though he knew Henry couldn't hear him. The words felt strange in the sterile air, too informal for the weight of the moment. He thought of all the times his father had spoken to him. The lessons he'd given, often in the form of simple observations rather than lectures. The world isn't always fair, son, but it's always watching. What you do matters. Darius had spent years living up to that belief, becoming a man who fought for justice, who challenged the unfairness of the systems he'd grown up navigating. Yet here he was, staring at a man who had done the same in his own quiet way. Lying helpless because of a system that had failed him. By the time Darius left the hospital, the night had settled over the town, the air thick with an uncomfortable stillness. Outside, a small crowd had begun to form. Protesters, perhaps, or simply curious bystanders. He walked past them without a word, his mind already spinning. The phone in his pocket buzzed messages from colleagues. News of the incident already spreading. A video had surfaced online. The grainy footage showed his father stepping into the confrontation. His posture calm, his words measured, and then came the shove. The punch. The fall. Darius watched the clip in silence. It didn't surprise him. He knew the patterns too well. This wasn't just about his father. It was about a system that allowed men like Officer Ethan Riggins to act with impunity, confident in the silence of those who should have held them accountable. Back in his office, Darius sat at his desk, the video playing on a loop on his computer screen. Each time he watched his father fall, the sound of his head striking the pavement echoing louder in his mind than it did in the recording. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. His chief legal advisor, a woman named Evelyn Grayson, stepped inside, a thick file in her hands. "It's already gaining traction," she said, setting the file on his desk. "The community is outraged. The department's staying quiet, but we've already received tips about Riggins's history. It's not good." Darius nodded, flipping through the file. Complaints against Riggins lined the pages: excessive force, racial profiling, abuse of authority. Most of them had gone nowhere, buried under layers of bureaucracy. "They knew," Evelyn said quietly, "and they let him stay on the streets." Darius closed the file, his jaw tightening. It wasn't anger he felt. Not exactly. It was something colder, sharper, a resolve that settled deep in his chest. "This isn't just about my father," he said, his voice low. "This is about the system that made Riggins think he could get away with it. And we're going to tear it apart." Evelyn nodded, her expression firm. "What's the next step?" Darius leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "We start with Riggins, then we go after everyone who protects him." As the night stretched on, Darius found himself back at the hospital. The streets outside were quiet, the protests having dispersed for the evening. He sat by his father's bedside, the hum of the machines the only sound in the room. "I'm going to fix this," he said softly. His voice didn't waver, though he spoke to a man who couldn't hear him. "For you, for everyone else they've hurt." The words hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. Outside, the world carried on, but inside that room, time seemed to stand still. Henry lay motionless, his face pale, his breathing shallow. Darius leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in his lap. He was a man of the law, a man who believed in facts and evidence. But in that moment, he allowed himself one small, quiet hope, that his father, somehow, could still hear him. The courthouse was quiet that morning, its gray stone facade catching the pale light of dawn. Inside, the halls echoed faintly with the sounds of shuffling papers and muted conversations. Darius Lawson arrived early, his footsteps deliberate on the polished floors, his mind already turning over the details of the case. On his desk lay a growing pile of documents, incident reports, witness statements, and the beginnings of what promised to be a damning investigation. Evelyn Grayson, his chief legal advisor, stood nearby, sorting through the latest batch of files. Her expression was grim. "They've been protecting him for years," she said, sliding a folder toward him. "Riggins has a record: complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and misconduct, all dismissed. No formal reprimands, no accountability." Darius flipped through the pages, his face impassive. The pattern was familiar. Complaints buried under layers of bureaucratic red tape, witnesses discouraged from pursuing their claims, and supervisors signing off on reports without so much as a second glance. "This isn't just about Riggins," he said quietly. "This is about the department. They didn't just let him get away with it, they enabled him." Evelyn nodded, her eyes sharp. "And the chief? He's implicated in the cover-ups. Internal memos show he signed off on dismissing several of the complaints." Darius exhaled slowly, the weight of the revelations settling over him. The truth wasn't surprising, but it was no less infuriating. It was one thing to suspect corruption, It was another to see it laid bare in black and white. The town outside was waking up, its streets bustling with early morning activity. At the local diner, conversations buzzed quietly over steaming cups of coffee. The incident in the park had become the only topic of discussion. "I always knew that cop was trouble," an older man muttered, shaking his head. "Saw him harassing a kid on Main Street last year. Didn't think nothing would come of it then, either." Across the counter, a woman folded her arms, her expression tense. "And now it's Henry Lawson. A man who's done nothing but good for this town. If they can do that to him, what does that mean for the rest of us?" The room fell quiet, the weight of her words lingering. Back at the courthouse, Darius reviewed the video footage again, his eyes tracing every detail. His father's calm demeanor, the steady way he approached the confrontation. The moment Riggins struck him. The video wasn't just evidence. It was a testament to how quickly control could shift. How power could be abused in the blink of an eye. The sound of a knock on the door broke his focus. Leah Daniels, a local civil rights activist, stepped inside. She was a familiar presence in the community, known for her quiet determination and the way she brought people together without fanfare. "Darius," she said, her tone measured, "we need to talk." He gestured for her to sit, closing the file in front of him. "The community's angry," she continued. "They're organizing protests. But they're also scared. What happened to your father? It's a reminder of what's been simmering under the surface for years. People are tired of feeling powerless." Darius nodded slowly. "They're right to be angry. But we have to be careful. If this spirals out of control, if protests turn into chaos, it'll give the department an excuse to shift the narrative." Leah tilted her head, studying him. "You think they're already working on one?" "I don't think," Darius said. "I know. Riggins called for backup before my father even hit the ground. They're crafting their story as we speak." By midday, the first protest had taken shape. A group of townspeople gathered in the park, holding handmade signs that read, "Justice for Henry," and "End police violence." The crowd was small but determined, their voices steady as they called for accountability. Leah stood at the edge of the group, her presence a quiet anchor. She noticed how some passers-by slowed to watch but didn't join. Fear, she thought. It was always fear. Fear of retaliation. Of being seen. Of speaking up in a place where silence had become second nature. Across town, Chief Malcolm Hayes sat in his office. The blinds drawn. The hum of his desk fan the only sound. A thick file lay open in front of him. The complaints against Riggins staring back like a mirror he didn't want to look into. He rubbed his temples, his frustration mounting. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not like this. The department had always operated on an unspoken rule: protect your own. Keep the peace. Avoid scrutiny. But now, with videos circulating online and the Attorney General personally involved, the old rules didn't seem to apply. The knock on his door startled him. An officer stepped in, his expression uneasy. "The protests are starting to grow, Chief. People are asking questions." Chief Hayes waved him off. "Let them ask. We'll handle it." But even as he said the words, he felt the ground shifting beneath him. That evening, Darius sat alone in his office, the weight of the day pressing down on him. His desk was cluttered with papers, his coffee gone cold. He thought about his father, about the lessons he'd taught him growing up, about the quiet strength that had always defined him. Henry had never been one to demand attention or recognition. He had simply lived by example, showing Darius what it meant to stand firm in the face of adversity. And now, lying in a hospital bed, he had become a symbol of something much larger than himself. Darius leaned back in his chair, his gaze unfocused. The road ahead was long, the obstacles daunting, but he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just about justice for his father. This was about changing a system that had failed too many for too long. And for the first time that day, he allowed himself a small, quiet moment of hope. The air in the courthouse felt heavier that day, as though the walls themselves carried the weight of what was unfolding within them. Darius Lawson sat at the long table in the conference room, surrounded by his legal team. The quiet hum of voices filled the space as they sifted through piles of documents. The clatter of keyboards a constant undercurrent. This is the file on Riggins, Evelyn Grayson said, sliding a thick folder toward Darius. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her unease. 32 complaints over the last decade. Only 2 were officially logged. None resulted in disciplinary action. Darius nodded, opening the folder. The papers inside were neatly organized, but their contents told a disorganized story. One of negligence, complicity, and a system designed to protect itself rather than the people it served. The names of those who had filed complaints blurred together as he scanned the pages. A young black man stopped for no reason. A mother accused of resisting arrest. A teenager shoved against a patrol car for matching a description. The patterns were clear, so was the inaction. They let him do this, Darius said quietly, his tone measured, not just once or twice, but over and over again. Evelyn's brow furrowed. And it's not just him. The chief's office signed off on dismissing most of these complaints. Some of them didn't even make it past the desk sergeant. The room fell silent. Outside the window, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the town square. Protesters had gathered there again, their signs a patchwork of demands for justice. The quiet murmur of their voices carried faintly through the glass, a reminder of the stakes. That afternoon, Darius attended one of the protests. Not to speak but to listen. The crowd had grown larger since the first gathering, their voices more confident. He stood at the edge, observing as Leah Daniels addressed the group. Her words were calm, deliberate. She spoke not with the fire of anger but with the steady conviction of someone who had lived the truth she was describing. This isn't just about one man, she said, her voice carrying across the square. It's about the patterns we've all seen, the stories we've all heard, the experiences we've shared but rarely spoken aloud. What happened to Henry Lawson is part of something bigger. And if we want change, we have to fight for it. Not just today, but every day. The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces a mixture of determination and fatigue. Darius watched as an older man raised his hand to speak. He introduced himself as a retired schoolteacher and described an encounter with Riggins years ago, when a student of his had been targeted for no reason other than the color of his skin. It was easier to look the other way back then, the man admitted, his voice heavy with regret. But I won't make that mistake again. Back at the courthouse, Darius and his team began piecing together their case. Witness testimonies, video footage, internal memos. Each piece of evidence added another layer to the narrative they were constructing. What about the whistleblower? Darius asked, glancing at Evelyn. She nodded. They're willing to testify anonymously. They've confirmed that the department routinely dismissed complaints against Riggins and others like him. There's also evidence of tampering with reports, details left out or altered to minimize the appearance of wrongdoing. Darius leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. It's not just about proving what Riggins did, he said. It's about showing how the system allowed it. We need to make it clear that this isn't one bad officer, it's a culture of silence and complicity. Evelyn hesitated. That's a harder argument to make. People like easy villains. Riggins is obvious. The system is harder to pin down. Darius met her gaze, his tone steady. We don't need it easy. We need the truth. Later that evening, Darius found himself at the hospital again. The room was dim, the soft beeping of the machines a constant reminder of how fragile his father's condition remained. He sat by Henry's bedside, the file on Riggins open in his lap. He wasn't sure why he'd brought it. Perhaps it was a way to keep himself grounded, to remind himself of the work that still needed to be done. You always said the fight was worth it, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Even when it felt like nothing would change. I'm starting to understand what you meant. Henry didn't respond, of course. He hadn't stirred in days. But Darius liked to think he could hear him. That somewhere, buried beneath the stillness, his father's resolve was still as strong as ever. The town was quieter that night, but the tension remained, palpable and unspoken. Inside the police station, Chief Malcolm Hayes sat at his desk, staring at the files his officers had reluctantly handed over. The evidence against Riggins was damning, but what worried him more was how much of it implicated the department as a whole. He rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had spent years keeping things under control. maintaining a delicate balance between enforcing the law and protecting his officers. But now, that balance was crumbling. Across the desk, an officer shifted uncomfortably. "What do we do, Chief?" he asked. The courtroom was almost silent except for the occasional rustle of papers or the creak of a chair. The air inside carried a kind of weight that everyone seemed to feel but no one dared acknowledge. Darius Lawson sat at the prosecution's table. His hands folded neatly, his expression unreadable. Across the room, Ethan Riggins sat stiffly, his face pale, his eyes darting to the floor and then back to the faces of those around him. This was the arraignment, the first official step in bringing the case against Riggins to court. Outside, the town buzzed with anticipation. But inside these walls, everything moved with measured precision. The judge entered, her presence commanding, though her voice was calm and steady as she addressed the court. "We are here to formally charge Officer Ethan Riggins with aggravated assault, misconduct in office, and violations of civil rights." The charges hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Riggins shifted uncomfortably, his lawyer whispering something inaudible in his ear. Darius didn't look at them. His focus was elsewhere, on the case file in front of him, on the people in the gallery, and on what this moment meant for the town. Outside the courthouse, the protest had grown. What had begun as a small gathering of locals was now a larger movement, with people from neighboring towns joining in. Signs bobbed in the crowd: "Justice for Henry," "Hold Riggins accountable," and "End police violence." Leah Daniels stood at the front, her voice calm but firm as she spoke into a microphone. "This isn't just about one man," she said. "This is about all the moments we've stayed silent. All the times we've looked away because we thought nothing would change. Today, we're saying no more." The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces a mix of hope and frustration. Among them were older residents who had lived through different kinds of struggles, their presence a reminder that the fight for justice wasn't new. Back in the courthouse, Darius called his first witness, a retired officer who had worked with Riggins years ago. The man hesitated as he took the stand, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for a way out. Darius approached the stand slowly, his voice even. "Thank you for being here today. I know this isn't easy." The man nodded, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his jacket. "No, it's not," he admitted. "You worked with Officer Riggins for how long?" 7 years, the man replied. "And during that time, were you aware of any complaints filed against him?" The retired officer hesitated. The room seemed to hold its breath. Finally, he nodded. "Yes, there were complaints." "Can you elaborate?" The man shifted in his seat. "There were incidents. He was rough with people. He targeted certain folks more than others. A lot of the time. It didn't feel right." Darius leaned in slightly, his voice soft but insistent. "And what happened to those complaints?" The man looked down at his hands. "They were dismissed, swept under the rug. The chief said it was better to keep things quiet, to avoid making the department look bad." That evening, Darius returned to the hospital. The room was as it had been for weeks, quiet. The machines beeping softly, the air sterile and still. His father's condition hadn't changed. But Darius spoke to him anyway, as he always did. "We're making progress," he said, sitting in the chair beside the bed. "People are starting to talk. The truth is coming out." He paused, his gaze settling on his father's face. "It shouldn't have taken this, though. It shouldn't have taken you lying here for people to see what's been wrong all along." He leaned back, the weight of the day pressing down on him. "I don't know if you can hear me, Dad, but I hope you know I'm not stopping. Not until we fix this." Across town, Chief Malcolm Hayes sat in his dimly lit office, staring at the stack of files on his desk. The whistleblower's testimony, the video evidence, the complaints against Riggins. All of it painted a picture he couldn't ignore. His phone buzzed, and for a moment, he considered not answering, but he picked it up. His voice heavy. "Yes? It's happening, Chief," the voice on the other end said. "The department's being investigated. They're not just looking at Riggins, they're looking at all of us." Hayes closed his eyes. He had known this moment was coming. He had spent years walking a fine line, protecting his officers while keeping the peace in the community. But now, that balance was gone, and the truth was catching up to him. The day ended quietly, the sun setting over a town that felt both familiar and changed. Darius sat in his office, the soft glow of his desk lamp illuminating the papers spread before him. He thought about the retired officer's testimony, about the people at the protest, about Leah's quiet determination. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt that they were on the right path. Outside, the courthouse square was empty now, the signs and banners left leaning against walls and benches. But their message remained, etched into the air like a promise. Change was coming. Hayes didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced out the window at the darkened streets, his expression unreadable. "We wait," he said finally, "and we hope." The hope, Darius knew, was misplaced. The system didn't fix itself. It never had. It required pressure, persistence, and a refusal to accept silence as an answer. As he sat alone in his office that night, the pieces of the case spread out before him. Darius felt the weight of the task ahead. It wasn't just about justice for his father. It was about dismantling a system that had failed too many for too long. He leaned forward, his pen moving steadily across the page as he drafted the next steps of their legal strategy. Outside, the first faint light of dawn began to creep across the horizon. The fight was far from over, but Darius was ready. For Henry, for the town, for all the voices that had gone unheard. The police station felt quieter than usual, though it was the kind of quiet that hummed with tension. The officers moved through the halls more deliberately, their voices hushed. There was an unspoken understanding among them that the world outside had shifted, and the walls they had relied on to shield them were now paper-thin. Ethan Riggins sat alone in a cramped interrogation room. His uniform was gone, replaced by a plain gray shirt that seemed to hang awkwardly on his frame. He stared at the table in front of him, his hands resting flat against its surface. The man who had once moved through this building with the unchecked confidence of authority now looked smaller. His shoulders hunched under the weight of what was coming. Across the table, his lawyer whispered in hurried tones. "This doesn't look good, Ethan," he said, his voice low. "The evidence against you is overwhelming. The video, the testimonies, the complaints, they're not going away." Riggins didn't respond. He wasn't sure he could. His mind was too crowded with the sounds of protests outside, the murmur of voices demanding justice, the thought of how quickly his life had unraveled. In the courthouse, Darius Lawson prepared for what would be the pivotal moment in the case. The formal arrest of Ethan Riggins. The indictment had been filed, and the warrant was issued. Now it was time to bring him in, to hold him accountable for what he had done. Evelyn Grayson entered the room, a file in her hands. "The media's already outside," she said, setting the folder on his desk. "They're waiting for the moment he's walked out in cuffs." Darius nodded, his expression unreadable. He wasn't one for spectacle. This wasn't about public humiliation. It was about justice. But he knew that the image of Riggins being led away would send a message. One that this town and others like it desperately needed to hear. The protests had swelled, spilling out into the streets surrounding the station. Leah Daniels stood near the front of the crowd, her voice steady as she spoke into a megaphone. "This isn't about revenge," she said, her words cutting through the noise. "This is about accountability. It's about showing that no one is above the law. Not even those who wear a badge." The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces reflecting a mix of exhaustion and determination. Some of them had been coming here every day since the attack on Henry Lawson. They knew the fight wasn't over. But this moment, seeing Riggins face the consequences of his actions, felt like a step forward. Inside the station, the arrest unfolded with little ceremony. Riggins stood as the officers approached, his face blank but his hands trembling slightly. The cuffs clicked into place with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been, echoing in the small room. He didn't resist. He didn't say a word. As he was led out of the building, the noise from the crowd outside grew louder. The chants of "Justice for Henry" rang out, a steady rhythm that seemed to reverberate through the air. Darius watched from a distance, his arms crossed over his chest. He had seen moments like this before in his career, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about Ethan Riggins. It was about the systems that had allowed him to act with impunity for so long. Later that evening, Darius returned to the hospital. The room was as it always was. Dim. Quiet. The machines keeping a steady rhythm. He sat by his father's bedside. The events of the day replaying in his mind. They arrested him, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. It's a start. But it's not enough. There's still so much to fix. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes tracing the lines of his father's face. Henry had always seemed larger than life to him. A man who could weather any storm. But now, lying motionless in that bed, he looked fragile, as though the years had finally caught up to him all at once. Darius closed his eyes for a moment, letting the exhaustion settle over him. He had spent weeks fighting for justice. But sitting here, he was reminded of how deeply personal this fight was. It wasn't just about the law or the system. It was about the man who had taught him what justice meant in the first place. Across town, Chief Malcolm Hayes sat in his office, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. The arrest of Riggins had been a turning point. But Hayes knew it wouldn't stop there. The investigation into the department was ongoing. And every file, every complaint that had been buried, was now coming to light. He stared at the framed photograph on his desk, himself surrounded by his officers. Their smiles frozen in time. The image felt hollow now. A reminder of a system that had been built on silence and complicity. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. An officer stepped inside, his expression uncertain. Chief, there's something you should see, he said, holding up a file. Hayes took it without a word, his hands heavy as he flipped through the pages. Inside were more complaints, more evidence of misconduct. Not just against Riggins but against others in the department. The patterns were clear, undeniable. Hayes closed the file and leaned back in his chair. He had spent years convincing himself that he was doing what was necessary. That protecting his officers was the same as protecting the town. But now, he wasn't so sure. That night, the town was quiet, the protests having dispersed for the evening. But the silence wasn't the same as it had been before. It wasn't the silence of fear or complacency. It was the quiet before something larger. Something more lasting. Darius sat in his office, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. He glanced at the files spread out before him, each one a piece of a larger puzzle. The arrest of Riggins was only the beginning. There were still questions to answer, still truths to uncover, and though the road ahead was long, Darius felt the faintest flicker of hope. Change wasn't easy, but it was possible. For his father, for the town, for all the voices that had gone unheard for too long. The courtroom was full. Rows of wooden benches, usually half empty for cases no one bothered to follow, were now packed with townspeople, reporters, and activists. Some sat in silent anticipation. Others whispered quietly among themselves. The air felt heavy, like the town itself was holding its breath. At the front of the room, Darius Lawson sat at the prosecution's table, his hands folded neatly on the surface in front of him. He wasn't looking at the defendant, Ethan Riggins, seated just a few feet away. Instead, his gaze was focused on the jury, a mix of familiar faces and strangers, all chosen to decide what felt like more than one man's fate. The trial was never going to be simple. It wasn't just about what had happened in the park that day or the punch that left Henry Lawson lying motionless on the pavement. It was about what the town had ignored for years, the quiet compromises, the unspoken rules, the way things had always been. The first witness took the stand, a young woman who had been in the park that afternoon. Her voice was steady, though her hands fidgeted nervously in her lap. She described what she had seen, how Henry had approached calmly, how Riggins had dismissed him, how the situation had escalated until there was no mistaking the violence. I recorded it, she said, her voice soft but clear. I thought, maybe someone would need to see it. Darius played the video for the jury. The grainy footage filled the screen, and the room fell silent as the events unfolded again. Henry stepping forward. Riggins's shove, the punch, the sickening sound of Henry's head hitting the pavement. When the video ended, there was no sound except for the faint hum of the projector. Darius stood slowly and faced the jury. This isn't about a single moment. he said, his voice calm but firm. This is about what led to that moment. And what allowed it to happen. Over the next several days, the prosecution presented its case piece by piece. Witnesses came forward, bystanders, former colleagues of Riggins, even a whistleblower from the department. Each one added another layer to the story, a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for years. One former officer described how complaints against Riggins had been ignored or dismissed. It wasn't just him, the man admitted, his voice heavy with regret. It was the whole system. No one wanted to rock the boat. The defense pushed back, arguing that Riggins had acted in self-defense, that the situation had been chaotic, that Henry had interfered where he shouldn't have. But the evidence was clear. And with each passing day, it became harder for anyone to deny the truth. Outside the courthouse, the protests continued. The crowd had grown quieter, more reflective. There was a sense among them that this moment was as much about the town as it was about the trial. Leah Daniels spoke to a reporter near the courthouse steps. This isn't just about accountability for one officer, she said. It's about accountability for all of us. For what we've allowed to happen. For the times we've stayed silent when we should have spoken up. Her words resonated with the older residents, many of whom had seen the town change over the decades but had also seen how much stayed the same. For them, this wasn't just a trial. It was a reckoning. In the courtroom, Darius called his final witness, a former police chief from a neighboring town. The man's testimony was damning, detailing how a culture of silence and protectionism could take root in law enforcement and how it had been allowed to fester in this department. Officers like Riggins don't act in a vacuum, the former chief said. They act because they believe there won't be consequences. And when there are no consequences, it sends a message. Not just to them, but to the entire community. The words lingered in the air, quiet but powerful. That evening, after court had adjourned for the day, Darius returned to the hospital. The room was the same as always, the machines beeping steadily, the faint smell of disinfectant hanging in the air. He sat by his father's bedside, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the trial. They're listening, he said softly. People are finally listening, but it shouldn't have taken this. Dad, it shouldn't have taken you lying here for them to see what's been right in front of them all along. He reached out and gently touched his father's hand. I don't know how this ends, but I know we're not going back to the way things were. I won't let that happen. Across town, Chief Malcolm Hayes sat in his office, staring at the files that had been turned over to the prosecution. Each page felt like a mirror, reflecting the choices he had made and the consequences he had ignored. He knew the trial wasn't just about Riggins. It was about the department. About him. And as he sat there, the quiet of the room pressing down on him, he wondered if the system he had spent his life defending could ever be truly fixed. The next morning, the courtroom was packed again as closing arguments began. Darius stood before the jury, his voice steady and measured. This case isn't just about what happened in the park, he said. It's about what happens when we allow injustice to go unchecked. When we look the other way. When we make excuses instead of holding people accountable. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Henry Lawson stepped forward that day because he believed it was the right thing to do. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't act with anger. He simply tried to help. And for that, he was met with violence. If we don't hold Officer Riggins accountable for his actions, what message does that send? To this town? To the next Henry Lawson who might think twice before stepping forward? He let the question hang in the air before returning to his seat. The room was silent, the jury deep in thought. The day ended as it began, with the town holding its breath. The jury would deliberate, but for now, all anyone could do was wait. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets. For the first time in a long while, those shadows felt lighter, less permanent. Change, it seemed, was no longer just a distant hope. It was here, in this moment, in this town, and it was just beginning. The verdict came on a quiet morning. The air in the courtroom was still, almost reverent, as the jury filed back in. Their faces were unreadable, their movements deliberate. Everyone watched them, the room heavy with expectation. Outside, the crowd had grown larger, spilling into the surrounding streets. Signs waved in the early light. And though the chanting had quieted, the energy was palpable. Darius Lawson sat at the prosecution's table, his expression steady, betraying none of the tension running through him. Across the room, Ethan Riggins sat stiffly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He glanced at his lawyer, who avoided his gaze. The foreperson stood, clearing her throat before speaking. In the matter of the state versus Ethan Riggins, we find the defendant guilty on all charges. The words echoed in the silence, breaking it like a sudden wave. There was no cheering, no outburst, just a collective release of breath, as if the entire room had been holding it at once. Riggins's shoulders slumped, his head bowing slightly. For a moment, he looked less like the man who had stood over Henry Lawson in the park and more like someone who had finally realized the weight of his choices. Darius nodded to himself, a quiet acknowledgement of the moment. It wasn't a victory, not really. It was accountability, a step towards something better. Outside, the news spread quickly. The crowd reacted not with celebration but with a kind of quiet resolve. Leah Daniels addressed the group, her voice carrying across the square. "This is a step," she said, "a necessary step. But it's not the end. It's not justice until the system changes. Until this stops happening in the first place." Her words resonated with the older residents, many of whom had lived through decades of struggle and change, only to see the same patterns resurface time and again. They nodded, their faces lined with understanding. Back at the hospital, Darius sat by his father's bedside. The room was unchanged, the machines beeping steadily, their rhythm a reminder of how fragile life could be. "We did it," Darius said softly. "He's been held accountable. They saw what he did. And they didn't look away." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "But it's not over, Dad. Leah's right. It's just a step. There's still so much to fix." For the first time in weeks, there was movement. Henry's hand twitched, just slightly, but enough to make Darius sit up straight. His breath catching, his father's eyelids fluttered, and a soft groan escaped him. "Dad?" Darius whispered, leaning closer. Henry's eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, before settling on his son. He didn't speak, but the faintest smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Darius felt a swell of relief, a quiet, profound gratitude. He reached for his father's hand, holding it gently. "We're going to be okay," he said. "I promise." In the days that followed, the town began to change. The police department announced a series of reforms. New oversight measures, mandatory training programs, and an independent review board to handle complaints. Chief Malcolm Hayes resigned quietly. His departure met with little fanfare. The protests shifted from demands for justice to calls for accountability and healing. Leah Daniels led community meetings, where residents shared their experiences and ideas for moving forward. The conversations were difficult but necessary, the kind of work that didn't make headlines but mattered deeply. At home one evening, Darius found himself looking through an old photo album. Pictures of his father from years ago filled the pages. Henry in his military uniform, standing tall and proud. Henry laughing with friends at the Veterans Hall. Henry at a family barbecue, flipping burgers with a grin on his face. He closed the album and sat in the quiet for a long moment. His father was recovering, slowly but steadily, but Darius knew the scars of what had happened would remain. Not just for Henry, but for the town. Justice wasn't a finish line. He realized, it was a process, a commitment to keep moving forward even when the road was long and the progress slow. The final community meeting was held in the park, the same place where it had all begun. The air was cool, the sun setting in soft shades of gold and orange. People gathered in a circle, their faces reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and hope. Darius spoke briefly, his voice calm and measured. "This isn't about erasing the past," he said. "It's about learning from it. It's about building something better. Not just for ourselves, but for the generations that come after us." The crowd nodded, some clapping softly, others simply listening. As the meeting ended, Darius walked to the edge of the park, where his father sat in a wheelchair, watching quietly. He knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We're getting there," Darius said. Henry smiled faintly, his voice raspy but steady. We always knew it wouldn't be easy. But you've done good, son. They sat together in the fading light, the park growing quiet around them. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't finished. But it was a start. And sometimes, a start was enough.